Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, July the 14th, 2021. I want to begin today by talking about struggle sessions. And I'll read a definition here from Wikipedia. Struggle sessions were a form of public humiliation and torture used by the Chinese Communist Party at various times in the Mao era, particularly during the years immediately before and after the establishment of the People's Republic of China and during the Cultural Revolution. The aim of struggle sessions was to shape public opinion, as well as to humiliate, persecute, or execute political rivals and those deemed class enemies. In general, the victim of a struggle session was forced to admit various crimes before a crowd of people who would verbally and physically abuse the victim until they confessed. Struggle sessions were often held at the workplace of the accused, but they were sometimes conducted in sports stadiums where large crowds would gather if the target was well known. Well, here in the West, we've moved on. We've advanced from the cultural revolutions. We now have struggle sessions of entire nations who are abused until they confess. And of course, I'm going to talk about the Italy versus England football debacle. Briefly, the game was tied 1-1 after 90 minutes, and then 30 minutes extra, and then 3 minutes of injury time. And so the game was to be decided by penalty kicks. And the manager of the English squad, Gareth Southgate, decided to do something clever, too clever by half. He was going to have the 3 black players on the team take the last 3 shots, and thus when England won the game, the black players would be the 3 lions, and this would definitively prove that multicultural England was better than stodgy old white England. Unfortunately for the manager, all 3 of the black players missed their shots. And so England won. And there was a furious outburst, furious disappointment, anguish even in England, and apparently some racially insensitive tweets were directed at the black football players, which has led to a complete mental and spiritual collapse in England, egged on by the media, of course. The media had been successful in making England go crazy over COVID-19, and they haven't ended yet. So feeling their strength, they decided they could make England lose its mind over some social media comments. I just confirmed this afternoon. I'd seen it mentioned, and I thought it can't possibly be true. That in the 123 minutes of regulation play, England had 1 shot on goal. 1 shot in 123 minutes. Were they even trying to win? That to me is more shameful than missed penalty shots. But no one is talking about that. At least, well, some people have mentioned the strangely defensive coaching style that England employed. So let's go to the Daily Mail. Now, I have to say that even before this barrage of suspicious racially insensitive tweets, a whole bunch of people on Twitter were saying that the Daily Mail was going to use the N-word. And of course, the Daily Mail would never do that. But it was clear by this that the fix was in right from the very beginning. Well, you know, heads I win, tails you lose, that if one of the English players had scored a winning goal, then that means diversity wins. And if they fail, which they did, that means that England is a wicked, racist, white supremacist country. Cue hysteria. From James Tapsfield, who is the political editor for the Mail Online, Boris Johnson announces online racists will be banned from football matches as Labour leader Keir Starmer accuses him of stoking culture war by sniping at England team for taking the knee amid outrage at more than 1,000 abusive tweets aimed at players. A series of vile racist tweets were sent to players after the loss in Euro 2020 final. Marcus Rashford, Bukayo Saka, and Jadon Sancho were all targeted with abuse. Johnson said extending football banning orders to include online abuse. Starmer accused him of stoking a culture war, and just absolutely incredible. The Labour leader attacked Johnson at Prime Minister's questions, demanding to know if he regretted branding the anti-racism symbol gesture politics. He jibed that the Premier had focused on fighting a culture war, but had now realized he was on the wrong side, with outrage at more than 1,000 racist tweets. Johnson replied, "I repeat that I utterly condemn and abhor the racist outpourings that we saw on Sunday night. And so what we're doing today is taking practical steps to ensure that the football banning order regime is changed so that if you are guilty of racist abuse online of footballers, then you will not be going to the match. No ifs, no buts, no exemptions, and no excuses." Tough talk from Boris Johnson. One government insider told Mail Online that the tone from ministers on taking the knee needed to shift because public views had. The dial has moved. If you look at the polls, you can see that. The England players have redefined taking the knee. Of course, taking the knee is an American recent tradition, which has absolutely nothing at all to do with England, which was not a slave country. In fact, since the 1950s or late 1940s, large numbers of Black people from the Caribbean and from Africa have chosen to live in England, despite its horrible racism. This is a spectacular example of what Chomsky and Herman called manufacturing consent going on here. In Hartlepool, the Tories were sending around leaflets pointing out that Keir had taken the knee. I don't think they would do that again. No one believes that Raheem Sterling wants to bring down capitalism or defund the police. In a stormy session of PMQs, Sir Keir said, "Does the Prime Minister think that it was wrong to criticize the England team's decision to oppose racism by taking the knee as gesture politics? Can he tell the House? Does he now regret failing to condemn those who booed England players for standing up to racism, yes or no?" Johnson replied, "We made it absolutely clear that no one should boo the England team. In addition to changing the football banning order regime, last night I met representatives of Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, and I made it absolutely clear to them that we will legislate to address this problem in the online harms bill. And unless they get hate and racism off their platforms, they will face fines amounting to 10% of their global revenues. We all know they have the technology to do it." Johnson defended Home Secretary Priti Patel's comments about taking the knee, saying that she had been fighting racism all her life, while also seeking to take practical steps to advance the cause of Black and minority ethnic groups. But Sir Keir responded, "We could all see what's happened here. The government has been trying to stoke a culture war, and they've realized they're on the wrong side, and now they're hoping nobody has noticed." Why else would a Conservative MP boast that he's not watching his own team? Why else would another Conservative MP say that Marcus Rashford spends too much time playing politics when he's actually trying to feed children that the government won't? And why will the Prime Minister refuse time and time again, even now, to condemn those who boo our players for standing up against racism? Why is it that this England team symbolizes that this Conservative Party is so afraid of? What is it, actually? So we see that another one of Enoch Powell's predictions has come true, that the Black man now has the whip hand in Britain. Again from the Mail, Jack Wright and Andrew Chamberlain. Greater Manchester Police have arrested the Savills estate agent who allegedly posted a racist tweet about Black England football stars after the Three Lions lost the European Championship to Italy. Andrew Bone, 37, self-presented at Cheadle Heath Police Station this morning and was subsequently arrested on suspicion of an offence under Section 1 of the Malicious Communications Act. Bone, a commercial building manager, claimed that his Twitter account had been hacked after a message was posted on his profile on Sunday which said N-words ruined it for us. After he was widely accused of being a racist, the post was deleted and Bone called for police to investigate. The message was posted shortly after England players Bukayo Saka, Marcus Rashford, and Jadon Sancho all missed their penalties in Sunday night's Euros final at Wembley Stadium. Savills said he had been suspended pending the outcome of the force's investigation. 3 officers carrying evidence bags and a police radio could be seen searching Bone's terraced home in Manchester today and spent 20 minutes gathering evidence before they left clutching a laptop. In a statement this afternoon, Greater Manchester Police said a suspect has been released under investigation. Detective Inspector Matt Gregory of the force's Trafford Division said the actions of a small number of people overshadowed what was a hugely unifying event for our country on Sunday evening. We are firm in our commitment. Any racist abuse, whether online or off, is not acceptable. Yes. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Radio host Mike Graham has called for racists to be stripped of their bank accounts, passports, and other life necessities. An interesting assertion given that Graham himself has been denounced as a racist numerous times before. Graham was responding to a controversy in the UK over racist social media posts targeting Black England football players, despite evidence suggesting the vast majority of the messages were sent by people in India and other South Asian and Middle Eastern countries. Graham said, I've got a plan. The time has come to not only find these people, not only to persecute them for their lawless behavior, but also basically to excommunicate them from our society. So forget about locking them up. Forget about throwing away the key. Forget about banning them from football stadiums. I've got a better idea. Instead, let's make it impossible for them to actually have a life. No bank account, no ability to travel, no passport, no benefits, nothing. Forget kick it out. Let's kick them out. We don't need them. Britain doesn't need them. Adios, amigos. Apparently, according to Graham, Watson writes, racists should be treated worse than convicted violent criminals and basically the same as terrorists and being stripped of their citizenship and made stateless. Nowhere in Graham's rant did he specify who gets to decide who is a racist and on what basis. Is booing take a knee racist? Should someone be treated like an ISIS jihadist because they don't like Black Lives Matter? The sheer weapons-grade idiocy of Graham's proposal is underscored by the fact that he's been accused of being a racist on numerous previous occasions. In 2019, Graham said, I hate Poles, live on air, prompting a listener to phone in, and they accuse him of being a racist for hating Polish people, Poles, P-O-L-L-S. In the mind of the caller, that was racist, and under his own plan for ending racism, Graham should have his bank account and passport seized. Last year, Graham was more seriously accused of anti-Irish racism after he repeatedly called Twitter user John O'Connell a paddy several times. Well, as a person of Irish descent myself, I'm not going to burst into tears or fly into a rage if someone calls me a paddy, but I understand that others feel differently. And from the same source, The Economist published a bizarre article bemoaning the lack of diversity in the Italian football team, with some asking if the same complaint would be made about Nigeria or Ghana. The most striking aspect of Italy's 26-man squad before it took to the pitch was that, alone among the main contenders, it did not include a single player considered as being of color, The Economist tweeted. The article goes on to suggest that the team's victory over England in the final of the Euros was a victory for the Italian right, presumably because England's first team included several black players, while Italy's starting 11 didn't contain any. However, demographic statistics illustrate how it's perfectly normal for Italy to have no black players. Unlike in numerous other European countries, Italy's black population is relatively low, about 1.5%, while more than 92% of the country is ethnically Italian or white. This means that out of Italy's 26-man squad for the Euros, you would statistically expect only 0.39% of their squad players to be black. In reality, Italy took one black squad player to the Euros, so black players were overrepresented in the Italy squad compared to national demographics. So according to The Economist, it is better to lose with blacks than win with whites. Yes, but this war on whites, this exterminationist language, it wouldn't go anywhere without the support of elite quislings. And they are the real enemy, the most dangerous enemy. Charlie Peters writes in Spiked, "Perhaps I am too naive. I really did think that the Euro 2020 final would escape the relentless racialization that has infected our society. I thought the England team would bring the nation closer in a collective moment of shared euphoria. And I thought this really would drown out the tired attempts to shoehorn race into yet another national occasion. After all, England had reached the final of an international football tournament for the first time in over half a century, and they were playing out the climax at Wembley, no less. Surely that would be enough to silence the tired, divisive bullshit we have had to endure since the killing of George Floyd kickstarted a ceaseless racial reckoning over a year ago. As the shock of defeat passed, the realization hit me that those who have tirelessly sought to insert race and racism into just about everything were soon going to be out in force, all because the three players who missed their penalties are black." And sure enough, within minutes of England's crushing defeat, the leftish Twitterati went to work. They urged fans not to be racist towards those players, all the while desperately looking for evidence that fans were doing precisely that. After all, this was too good an opportunity to miss for Twitter's virtue signalers, always keen to berate England as a nasty, bigoted backwater. They quickly found the instances of online racism they were looking for. It didn't seem to matter that most of the tweets seemed to come from fake accounts, recently activated and with low follower counts. Nor did it matter that these accounts often originated overseas, often in countries with significantly more racist populations than England, such as Italy, where fans still throw bananas at black players. Then a mural in Manchester of penalty misser Marcus Rashford was defaced. This was eagerly denounced as yet more evidence of racism by the right on, and as a hate crime by Manchester police, that this vandalism consisted of the words shite and bastard rather than any actual racist terms seemed to pass the Twitterati by. It was still treated as yet more proof of England's endemic bigotry. There was one confirmed instance of an Englishman posting a racist remark about one of the three black England players who missed their penalties. It spread across the internet like wildfire. Within an hour, the Twitter warriors had his name, his work, and his family enough to hang him with. That didn't sate the racist finder generals, though. It just fueled their hunger for more. Momentum continued to gather around this overhyped tale of the racist abuse of England's footballers. Downing Street and the FA rushed to condemn it, with Boris Johnson describing the abuse as appalling. Not that condemning the abuse helped Johnson. Others were quick to berate him himself for not doing enough to stop it. Meanwhile, few have bothered to question whether there really was an outpouring of online racist abuse, as has been described. Commentators have just accepted that there was, largely because that is what they want to believe. If they had spoken to industry experts and security professionals, as I did, they might have had a better understanding as to what was going on. Those experts told me that racist abuse of English footballers does exist, but that much of it comes from foreign accounts and bots. It doesn't come from frustrated and virulently intolerant English people firing off salvos of abuse while pissed up and pissed off. Manager Gareth Southgate must have been recently told the same. He explained to no doubt disappointed reporters yesterday that a lot of the abuse has come from abroad. People that track those things have been able to explain that. These are the cold and sober facts of the matter. Well, here's another cold and sober fact. That if you have minorities in your country, you will be condemned as racists and white supremacists. It makes no difference how they're treated. It makes no difference how much they're promoted simply for their skin color. It makes no difference what extra benefits, gibs they get. It makes no difference how much everyone else grovels to them. White supremacism is an original sin that apparently all people are cursed with, and there is no Jesus of anti-racism who is going to show us the road to salvation. I always laugh, for instance, when I hear that Canada is a much more racist country than it used to be. Well, in 1971, I believe Canada was 97% white. There's your answer. There is your answer. And of course, the obvious riposte to people clamoring about Canada or Britain, again, is if these countries are so terrible, why is it that non-white people are willing to risk their lives on rubbish boats in order to get to England? There is no answer to that question. But it's not really a question that is asked. Oh, let's see. Again, from Summit News, a petition that calls for the government to pass a law that mandates people provide a verified ID before they are able to open a social media account currently has over 633,000 signatures. And again, we have some data. We have some data on where the tweets were coming from. And it would appear that most of them didn't come. Anyway, since Twitter, you can be anonymous on Twitter, it's the easiest thing in the world for people looking to foment a hate against white people to write nasty things about blacks and other minorities. Tom Harwood, who is political correspondent and presenter at GB News, tweets, "The Center for Identifying Digital Hate identified 105 Instagram accounts that directed racial abuse against Rashford, Sacco, and Sancho. BBC Newsnight analyzed the location of these accounts, of those they could identify, 59 outside the UK and just 5 within the UK. But I guess that's 5 too many. And England, white people must suffer because of a few mean tweets on Twitter. Let's go back to the chat, or let's go to the chat for the first time. Hello to Random Number Generator, Tricky Who, Palcasso 88, Dan Allison, Don from Beyond, Glib Medley. Glib Medley comments, "The feds knocked on my door today, confiscated my Lego model of KMG's motel room." It's pretty good. Hello to Gamion and Dan. Star Rover. Star Rover says England's coach sabotaged winning by using less skilled players to appease the PC gods. Could they have lost the penalty to punish England for doing racisms, says Gamion? I don't think so. I mean, the black players seem to be genuinely shattered by their failure. And I feel rather sorry for them, actually. Chogokin666 has some news for us. I finally got my $600 stimulus check today. My life is complete. Halper says, "Love me footy, love me cider, hate racial inequity." Anrun says, "Finally, our long national nightmare is over. Congrats, Chogokin666. And manufactured controversy, make penalty, blacks are our lions. Yes, yes. Gamian says, I'm starting to dislike people named Osaka. Anran says, I was slightly surprised by this. I didn't think Graham was that big a creep. Well, Graham has regularly had Peter Hitchens on his show to decry, COVID lockdowns, masking, virtual distancing, and the like. Perhaps he thinks that he's been so very controversial about COVID-19 that he has to triangulate and tell the world just how very much he hates racism more than any other white person, it would seem. Jim Smith says, I don't think it will be long before a Democrat offers a bill making it a criminal offense to utter or write comments deemed racist, and Republicans would quickly chime in their support. Steve says, the conservative case for hate speech laws. Let's talk about Australia. Steve Saylor has a column up today at Takis Magazine on a subject which he has touched on several times in the past. It is called The Flight from White Down Under. One of the last essays that Shiva Naipaul wrote, which is collected in the last collection of his work, he went to Australia and was appalled, sickened by the groveling to Aborigines, which was apparent, even in the 1980s, renaming Ayers Rock and the like. I suspect that the Spectator wouldn't dare publish this essay today for fear that they would be arrested. Saylor writes, granted, the concept of white privilege has already achieved mental hegemony, but is it true? It can be tested simply by measuring whether more people on the racial margins are attempting to pass from being considered non-white to white, as happened in the increasingly distant past, or instead from white to non-white. Today, we see an increasing number of white-looking individuals, especially leftist female professors of grievance studies, striving for the privileges of being officially non-white. This has become hilariously common in Australia, where the newspapers are full of the path-breaking feats of the first Indigenous this or that, almost always with a photo of an extremely white-looking person. The number of Australians who identify as Aboriginal has been soaring, especially in the metropolitan areas of the East Coast, far from Indigenous settlements in the outback. Full-blooded Aborigines, in contrast, are not doing well in modern Australia. In desperation, back in 2007, Canberra tried to cut down on the horrific rate of child sex abuse among Indigenous communities in Northern Australia by banning alcohol and pornography. Outside of athletes, such as 1970s tennis champion Yvonne Goolagong, non-white Aboriginals are seldom well represented in the more competitive sectors of Australian life. They appear especially ill-equipped at generating critical race theory verbiage to lecture whites on their racial sins. But whites in Australia will not forego such a fundamental pleasure of the contemporary world, so a sizable cast of white-appearing academics and pundits has arisen to make their livings as professional Aborigines, castigating the white man. Whites in Australia are never supposed to question the authenticity of these self-declared natives, but these experts themselves tend to be suspicious of each other's Aboriginal bona fides. For example, the Australian and the Daily Mail's Antipodal edition recently ran articles on the complaints of two different female Aboriginal identifying academics about box tickers and 9 to 5 blacks who get the career and financial privileges of being nominally Indigenous in 21st century Australia without really being Aboriginal. With another Australian census coming up shortly, both essays note that the number of individuals identifying as nothing but Aboriginal has been rising in this century, far faster than natural increase could allow. Similarly, in the United States, the Navajo Nation's rolls exploded from 306,000 in 2020 to 399,000 in 2021 in order to cash in on federal coronavirus payouts handed out through the tribe. The Daily Mail reports that Dr. Victoria Grieve Williams, whose bio states that as a recipient of 3 ARCDI grants, she has published extensively, including on race and gender in Australian, Aboriginal, and transnational histories, as dishing about an unidentified rival in affirmative action academia. And in the Australian, Suzanne Ingram, a PhD student in health communications, who is chair of the Redfern-based Black Theatre Company, board member of Mudgingal Aboriginal Women's Corporation, and advocates for the Redfern Aboriginal Women's Alliance, explains how suspected academic imposters on the Indigenous gravy train sidestep her interrogations. Quote, box tickers have become adept at using defense strategies such as lateral violence, a concept that colonized people have internalized oppressive colonialist behaviors and turn on each other rather than the colonizers to silence Aboriginal people who question them, unquote. Strikingly, while both essays tattled on rival women professors, neither lengthy essay disclosed the specific names of the box tickers instead of just describing them generally. This reticence is presumably due to the 2011 Federal Court of Australia's Eatock versus Bolt decision, in which Judge Mordecai Bromberg ruled that conservative pundit Andrew Bolt had violated the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975 by making fun of various fair-skinned professional Aborigines. Saylor continues, even more strikingly, both of the new accusers themselves wear their hair blonde. Grieve Williams looks rather like Donald Trump's first wife, Ivana, and Ingram resembles a Dutch milkmaid. That doesn't prove that they, or for that matter, their unnamed rivals, whom they accuse of being fakes, have absolutely no Aboriginal ancestry. Even the whitest-looking Australians may well have considerably more non-white ancestry than, say, Senator Elizabeth Warren. And, of course, when you have a system, a racial spoils system, well, that leads to certain awkward questions. For instance, what constitutes Black? Or, what constitutes Asian? Or, what constitutes Aboriginal? What constitutes Native Indians in Canada? And one might expect that this would lead to the publishing of Nuremberg laws, because if one can obtain substantial benefits simply by making a claim which is prima facie false, then obviously it's going to lead to widespread fraud. I remember back during the Oka crisis of the 1990s, when I saw on television regularly one of the leaders of the resistance to building a golf course. And this woman, who was presumably or putatively Canadian Native Indian, had blonde hair and green eyes. A story from the CBC last month. An award-winning and influential Algonquin rights activist and professor at Queen's University faces mounting scrutiny over the legitimacy of his claim of Indigenous identity. Robert, or Bob, Lovelace, who won an award from the Kingston, Ontario University in 2016 for his years of exemplary leadership in teaching, mentoring, and building the profile of Indigenous issues, is often credited for playing a pivotal role in establishing the Indigenous curriculum at Queen's. A CBC News investigation, however, has revealed questions about Lovelace's Indigenous claims. Earlier this month, an anonymous report circulated online alleging 6 people connected to Queen's, including Lovelace, made false claims about their Indigenous heritage. Shortly after its publication, the university strongly rejected the report's allegation. That rejection was then met by an open letter signed by almost 100 Indigenous academics calling on the university to examine the potential harm of misrepresentation among faculty and staff. The letter articulated the thinking behind a growing movement among Canadian Indigenous leaders and scholars that demand universities and other public institutions reserve positions and grants earmarked for Indigenous people. They say people with questionable Indigenous heritage should not hold those positions of influence because it undermines Indigenous autonomy and authority over all. The letter also said that membership in Indigenous communities is a matter of integrity and reciprocity, and that unilateral claims to these communities cast their legal order and protocols as insufficient, primitive, or backwards, and are a continued act of racism towards nations and societies Canada has violated repeatedly since European contact. Well, here's my modest proposal: that we either get rid of the racial spoil system that exists in Canada, whereby Indians receive all sorts of benefits simply by virtue of their ethnicity, that we get rid of that, or we institute a Nuremberg system with a cutoff point of, I don't know, 50%, 40%, 25%, that if, 23andMe testing reveals that your indigenous ancestry is below the limit, you don't get any. Of course, Canada is a country that still, for some reason, continually congratulates itself on its equality, whereas Canada is officially, according to the Charter of Rights, not equal. Canada is committed to not treating people equally. But the shakedowns continue. This is from the Hill Times. Mike LaPlante. Black public servants class action suit litigants seeking $100 million mental health fund from feds. The legal team representing hundreds of current and former Black federal employees, now part of a proposed multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit against the federal government, has filed a motion in federal court for the government to implement a $100 million mental health fund to address mental injuries and ongoing challenges faced by Black public service workers. The class proceeding, filed December 2nd of last year, alleges decades-long discrimination, lack of advancement opportunities, and harassment of Black public servants, and includes plaintiffs from a wide range of government departments and agencies, including the Canada Revenue Agency, Employment and Social Development Canada, Corrections Canada, the Department of National Defense, and the RCMP. Well, there's a long tradition of this in the United States, both in government and in private industry, where minorities, typically Blacks, get together and they allege discrimination. How are they discriminated against? Well, I'm not a vice president with a corner office, so there it is, QED. And of course, the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau is going to cave. Of course, it is going to cave. They talk about this mental health fund. Can these Black civil servants, current and former, can they draw from this? And if they can, does it have to be used for mental health services or just to make the plaintiffs feel better? I suppose we'll find that out eventually. This is from Thomas Lifson at American Thinker. For those who see the hand of God in extraordinary natural phenomena, a lightning strike in Toledo, Ohio is being seen as divine retribution. Others call it karma. Witnesses reported that lightning struck a George Floyd memorial mural, not only burning the artistic expression, but collapsing the brick wall on which it was painted. No word yet on what may have caused the collapse, according to WTVG. And we get pictures of before and after pictures. The great aggregator of tweets, Twitchy, has not yet collected the tweets being posted in response, but plenty of people are laughing at the symbolism while others piously bemoan their sentiments and or denounce them as racists. There are plenty of people calling it an act of God or divine retribution for idolizing a career criminal and drug addict. We heart masculinity and chivalry don't change, or at Daily Riona. My favorite comment, what caused the collapse? White lightning, I presume. And what Fast Eddie Baseman for, he came up with his own idea of a mural for George Floyd, and it shows Floyd sticking a loaded pistol in the stomach of a pregnant woman, which is what George Floyd did. She was a girl that was kidnapped by George Floyd and beaten brutally during a home invasion. George and his accomplices searched her apartment for drugs and money. She was pregnant. Soon it will be a crime to laugh at this sort of thing. And be very careful what you say around your children. Dan Galerter at American Greatness writes about the story of the FBI's family tweet. On Monday, the FBI released its now infamous tweet, quote, "Family members and peers are often best positioned to witness signs of mobilization to violence, help prevent homegrown violent extremism." This was an unfortunate bit of wording and an unfortunate bit of timing. In fairness to the FBI, the pamphlet the Bureau links to in the tweet, ponderously titled "Homegrown Violent Extremist Mobilization Indicators," is not directed towards Joe Biden's version of domestic terrorists. Its subject is Americans who are attempting to aid a foreign terrorist organization. Yes, Glernter says, it is gratifying that the FBI remembers that Islamic terrorism is a genuine threat of the sort that actually kills people. This comes hard on the heels of the Attorney General's press statement saying the Justice Department has reached several benchmarks in their January 6th investigation, including 500 total arrests and 100 arrests on charges of assaulting a federal law enforcement officer. Arrest quotas are an idea that Merrick Garland got from Lenin. This right after the White House's June 15th fact sheet on domestic terrorism, which warns us to be on the lookout for anyone advocating the superiority of the white race or anyone who is anti-government or anti-authority, such as militia violent extremists. The White House also says it will work to counter disinformation, misinformation, and dangerous conspiracy theories online, which I suppose means us. The FBI has been playing a crucial part in this campaign with despicable pre-dawn flashbang raids, charging in with weapons drawn to ransack the homes of senior citizens who, the FBI knows perfectly well, pose no physical threat whatsoever. American Greatness's Julie Kelly recently detailed these malfeasances. So it is hardly surprising, Glernter argues, that many people assume the FBI's tweet referred to the ongoing campaign against freedom waged by a government that feels itself to be insecure. Still, if I were the FBI right now, I'd probably be wondering, why is everybody ganging up on us over this tweet? This time, we weren't even doing anything wrong. Well, here's the thing, FBI. Asking family or neighbors to snitch for the government has a bad record. The Nazis loved it, the French under the Germans were experts at it, and the Soviets pioneered it. Every fascist or communist government in history has relied for its own survival on turning family members and friends against one another. Unfortunately, I suspect the FBI will have trouble understanding why such a technique shouldn't be used here as well. In America, presumably, we're snitching for good, not for evil. So if it helps fight crime, why not? And I'm going to talk about crime in New York City in just a minute. But before I do, let's return to the chat. Birkin Sultanov says female mental health, growth sector. Garland, creepy voice from Dark Shadows soap opera. And Sultanov adds, cinching in Cuba was modeled after the Chinese model. Ameriqua has progressive Nuremberg laws when it comes to the Prague stack. Clown Velt says war before civilization is a decent account of the practices common in pre-colonial cultures. Good Medley says Abbo's huffing fumes is cultural appropriation. Star Rover says Stefan Molyneux horrified the Australian establishment during his 2018 speaking tour by telling the truth about how savage and primitive Aborigines were before British settlers arrived. Yes. So let's talk about Heather McDonald and crime in New York City. You will remember yesterday that Paul Krugman wrote an absurd, a disingenuous article. Why are people complaining about crime rates in New York City? New York City is much better than it used to be. McDonald begins, for 2 decades, many New Yorkers had assured themselves that a return to the crime and squalor of the early 1990s was unlikely. Former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who presided over a 62% drop in major felonies from 1994 through 2001, proved that violence was not an urban inevitability. His successor, Michael Bloomberg, drove crime down further through the 2008 recession and beyond. Both mayors set a benchmark for what was possible, preemptively discrediting any future mayor's excuse the crime was beyond his capacity to overcome. I remember very well the 1970s and 1980s, where pundits pretty much across the board, I suppose with the exception of James Q. Wilson, said rampant crime, mugging, shootings, murders, nothing we can do about it. It's out of our hands. Graffiti on the inside and outside of every New York City subway train, nothing that can be done. Yes, I saw that in the magazine, the quarterly, that the public interest that Irving Kristol edited. It's too big a problem to solve. Well, it got solved. Back to McDonald. That assumption about the permanence of the crime drop was wrong. New York City in 2020 experienced an unprecedented one-year increase in homicides and shootings. Through December 27, 2020, the number of murders was up 41% from 2019 and 53% from 2018. Shooting victims were up 103% from 2019 and 109% from 2018. Shooting incidents rose 97% and 104%. In gang-ridden precincts, the spike was even more startling. In Brooklyn's Brownsville and Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhoods, there were 170% more shooting victims in 2020 than in 2019, and 151% more shooting incidents. Murder was up 94% in these parts of Brooklyn. It wasn't just gang areas that were afflicted. On December 29th, a roving pack of young bicyclists in Midtown Manhattan attacked a BMW, smashing a bike on top of the car and jumping on its windshield. The same group went after a cab minutes later. Other workers in the area have been chased by similar flash mobs. The 2020 increase is actually worse than the annual numbers suggest. Street crime dropped from March 2020 to late May 2020 due to the coronavirus lockdown. The 2020 increase incorporates that early crime drop. Measured from June to the end of 2020, the rise in violence would be even more extreme, and it has continued to 2021. Shootings citywide were up 20% through February 14th, 2021, compared with the first 6 weeks of 2020. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio has seemed almost blasé about this crisis as he begins his final year in office. The reason for that passivity is the same as the reason for the crime increase itself: the dominance of anti-racism as the overriding policy concern among liberals and progressives. As long as anti-racism remains the primary focus of New York's leaders, the crime surge will continue. De Blasio's early mayoralty suggested that the Giuliani-Bloomberg benchmark was in fact checking the default leftism of New York's leadership class. De Blasio chose as his police commissioner William Bratton. Bratton had engineered the crime turnaround of the 1990s as Giuliani's first police commissioner. Selecting Bratton angered de Blasio's left-wing base, which demanded a black or female commissioner, or ideally both. But de Blasio wanted maximal insurance against a crime increase, so he went with the sure bet. His next two commissioners were also white males, chosen for their likely ability to keep crime down. Over the last year, however, something even more powerful than a concern for one's political legacy has arisen: the need to signal a commitment to fighting white supremacy. Following the death of George Floyd in May 2020, racial inequalities have become the obsession of the nation's elites. Almost any public matter may be turned into a race issue, including Donald Trump's battle in late 20 and early 2021 to overturn the presidential election results. The core concern of the anti-racism crusade, however, is policing and incarceration. This is not a new focus, but in 2020, it became ever more destructive of law and order. For years, anti-police activists, academics, and liberal politicians have decried the overrepresentation of blacks in the criminal justice system. Blacks make up about 12% of the nation's population, but they account for 1/3 of the combined federal and state prison rolls. Their per capita rate of imprisonment is more than 4 times higher than the per capita imprisonment rate of whites. Racism on the part of cops and prosecutors is the only permissible explanation for that disparity. Acknowledging the vastly higher black crime rate is taboo. The black incarceration rate is driven by convictions for violent crime, not, as popular lore has it, by convictions for drug offenses. 62% of Black prisoners in state facilities, which house the vast majority of the nation's prisoners, were serving time for a violent offense in 2018, compared with 48% of white state prisoners. If, as anti-racism orthodoxy dictates, the root causes of higher Black crime, above all family breakdown, may not be discussed, then the only way to reduce racial disparities in the criminal justice system is to stop penalizing criminal behavior. Such decriminalization efforts were ongoing in New York before 2020. The New York City Council and the New York State Legislature had lightened traditional penalties for a host of public order offenses such as public urination and public drinking. Bail was eliminated for misdemeanors and many felonies. The Manhattan and Brooklyn district attorneys competed for the most sweeping deprosecution initiatives. Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance announced that he would not prosecute turnstile jumping, calling it a crime of poverty. Actually, it's a crime of arrogance, as a retired NYPD chief notes. Not to be outdone, Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez stopped sending most youthful gunslingers into detention, diverting them instead into poorly managed social services programs. Meanwhile, officers who put pressure on a resisting suspect's back or chest to subdue his violence could now be criminally charged. These anti-racism initiatives were just warm-ups. The more frenzied dismantling of law enforcement began in mid-2020, triggered by the national riots over the death of George Floyd. Floyd died on May 25, 2020, after resisting arrest for allegedly trying to pass a counterfeit bill in Minneapolis. Video captured an officer pinning Floyd face down on the ground with a knee to the nape of his neck for nearly 9 minutes. Though subsequent evidence arguably undercuts the claim that Floyd died from that police hold, the incident was universally treated as a manifestation of the lethal police brutality that Blacks endure on a daily basis. Minneapolis was the first city to burn, and riots soon spread across the country. In New York City, caravans of looters smashed storefronts and made off with millions of dollars in luxury merchandise and dollar store inventory alike. Rioters burned police cars and attacked officers with bottles, bricks, cement blocks, and jagged metal pipes. Officers worked back-to-back shifts with no time to sleep. Nearly 400 officers were injured. More than 200 police cars were vandalized. As darkness fell each night, the city cowered behind plywood barriers hastily erected over apartment building entrances and commercial storefronts. De Blasio called the unrest very justified and asked the police to use a light touch because people are undeniably angry for a reason. Not surprisingly, the violence continued unabated, finally pushing the mayor to impose an 8 p.m. curfew. Manhattan DA Vance was not cooperating. Vance would not be prosecuting curfew violations or other riot-related offenses like disorderly conduct and resisting arrest, his office announced. The capitulation continued. On June the 15th, Police Commissioner Dermot Shea announced that he was dismantling the undercover units tasked with getting armed felons off the streets. This abdication was being done in the name of serving the community, code for avoiding disparate impact. The so-called anti-crime units were among the last NYPD entities that forthrightly used their constitutional power to stop, question, and sometimes frisk individuals engaged in criminally suspicious behavior, a legal tactic contrary to what New York's political class believes. Shea labeled it brute force. There's a very long article, which I commend to you. You can find it at city-journal.org. And again, it's Heather McDonald. And McDonald spells her last name curiously with a space between the Mac and the Donald. There are any number of articles such as this, but they all point to the same lesson, that you can have official anti-racism or you can have civilization. You cannot have both. And here's another crisis, not as sexy as COVID-19. This is a story by Betsy McKay in the Wall Street Journal. U.S. drug overdose deaths soared nearly 30% in 2020, driven by synthetic opioids. Fentanyl, along with isolation and stress from COVID-19 pandemic, propelled surge, experts say. The estimated 93,331 deaths from drug overdoses last year, a record high. And I should explain that when they talk about drug overdoses in this context, They are not including accidental drug overdoses, of which I believe there are over 100,000 deaths in the United States every year. But the death from drug overdoses represents the sharpest annual increase in at least 3 decades, and compare with an estimated toll of 72,151 deaths in 2019. This is a stunning number, even for those of us who have tracked this issue, said Brendan Saloner, Associate Professor of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Our public health tools have not kept pace with the urgency of the crisis. The surge, the 2020 data show, was driven largely by a proliferation of fentanyl, a powerful synthetic opioid whose use has spread across the nation. The pandemic amplified the epidemic of overdoses, bringing on social isolation, trauma, and job losses, according to addiction experts and treatment providers. Overdose deaths began rising in the fall of 2019 with the spread of fentanyl, but really took off starting in March 2020 when pandemic-driven shutdowns and physical distancing measures set in. It's really one of those things where 2020 turbocharged something that was already wildly out of control, Saloner said. Fentanyl, which is 50 times more potent than heroin, is now frequently mixed into other widely used illicit drugs, often when the user is unaware, according to Monique Tula, Executive Director of the National Harm Reduction Coalition. Yes, harm reduction. Remember how being nice to junkies was going to result in less harm? No, it has resulted in exactly the opposite. And now we have Chuck Schumer proposing that marijuana be legalized nationally. And we have the usual suspects saying that the solution to the epidemic in illegal drug overdoses is to legalize all drugs. But that's certainly, this line is being pushed very hard in Canada. And as I've mentioned many times on this live stream, you can see and hear the results. If I step over there and look across the street to the government homeless shelter, whose residents, if they ask, are given high-quality heroin free by the Canadian government, because that is part of harm reduction. So, in other struggle session news, this is by April Glazer at NBC News. At least 2 Amazon employees have resigned in recent weeks to protest the company's decision to continue to sell a book they say frames young people who identify as transgender as mentally ill. The resignations come after a complaint posted to the company's internal message board in April drew the support of over 467 Amazon corporate employees. As of last year, the company employed over 1.3 million people worldwide and is the second largest employer in the U.S. The complaint by workers points to a decision Amazon shared with Republican senators in March that claims it had chosen not to sell books that frame alphabet people identity as a mental illness. Yeah, you notice how they have all the initials in the plus sign there, LGBTQ+. Even if you were to claim that Abigail Schreier's book frames trans identity as a mental illness, which it doesn't, that would not affect the L, the G, the B, the Q, and the plus. Just the T. But there are a unity, a formidable unity. What on earth lesbians, gays, and bisexuals have in common with transsexuals is an interesting question that I've never seen answered. The employee-led petition calls for the removal of the book Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters by Abigail Schreier. In it, she explores what she calls a trans epidemic of young girls identifying as transgender. The book is currently listed as the first, second, and third bestsellers for the hardcover, softcover, and Kindle editions in Amazon's category of alphabet people demographic studies. While Schreier denies that her book frames alphabet people identities as a form of mental illness, employees at Amazon pointed to a passage where Schreier writes, quote, "Many of the adolescent girls suddenly identifying as transgender seem to be caught in a craze, a cultural enthusiasm that spreads like a virus," unquote. Schreier goes on to define craze as crowd mental illness. Elsewhere in the book, Schreier likens therapists who affirm the gender of transgender patients with affirming a young person's anorexia by agreeing that they are fat. We wouldn't think such a therapist was compassionate. We might think she was a monster, Schreier writes. One of the employees who resigned over Amazon's decision to continue to sell the book, Celine Zenia, a software engineer who identifies as trans and worked at Amazon for 7 years, said she left in June after learning the company would still carry the title. She was happier with a decision Amazon made several months before to stop carrying another book when Harry became Sally, responding to the transgender movement because of its framing of transgender identity as a form of mental illness. But she still says this latest move by Amazon to continue to sell Irreversible Damage went too far. I would suspect that Amazon sells hundreds or thousands of books which make the claim that supporters of Donald Trump suffer from a mental illness. But no one's calling for these books to be removed by Amazon. Xenia says, the book literally has craze in the title and considers being transgender a mental illness in many senses throughout the book. I found it extremely hypocritical for Amazon to say that it would stock this book and not another one. It looks like Amazon had to remove that particular book for PR reasons, not because they felt morally obligated to. Schreier said in a statement, this issue won't go away just because some disgruntled Amazon employees wish it would. And banning the book won't help these girls or anyone else. My book goes out of its way to honor the experiences of transgender adults, never disparages them, and never implies that the trans identity is a mental illness, unquote. Well, I have read the book, and I highly recommend it, and it is true. The claim that she makes. Schreier is far more sympathetic towards trans people than I am. For instance, what the book is mainly about is, people who, particularly young girls, who see YouTube videos or hear people talking about it in school or social media and decide overnight, without any evidence of any previous gender dysphoria, as it's called, that they are, in fact, boys. She has a great deal of respect for people typically older who have made the transition, a respect I do not share. But I say all this just to let people know that Schreier was not lying in her statement. Schreier testified before Congress against the passage of the Equality Act this year, which would provide non-discrimination federal civil rights protection for alphabet people in issues like employment, housing, credit, and education. The bill passed the House in February and now awaits a Senate vote. In response to the news in May that some employees opposed Amazon's carrying the book, Schreier wrote on Twitter that anyone who thinks my book advances a narrative of transgender identity as a disease hasn't read it or is a bona fide idiot. Cecilia Fan, an Amazon spokeswoman, said in a statement that the company is dedicated to providing access to diverse viewpoints. Last year, Amazon blocked the selling of a self-published ebook that claimed the harms of the coronavirus were overstated, but reversed its decision after Elon Musk tweeted that the company's decision was insane. Amazon has also removed books by David Duke, the former head of the Ku Klux Klan, as well as books by George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party. Yes, and then NBC News goes to the experts, and the experts are all against Schreier. There's no attempt at any fairness. Yes, they did print a statement from Schreier, but presumably they could have found several people who agree with Schreier's position. Healthcare professionals who specialize in serving transgender and gender nonconforming youth say books like Schreier's are troubling since they may be read by parents as general resources. Yes, and we always let patients diagnose themselves, don't we? Dr. Erica Anderson, a clinical psychologist at the Child and Adolescent Gender Center and the president of the United States Professional Association for Transgender Health, said, my concern is that people would look to this book for guidance about these things rather than the professional societies, including my own, which all observe and have for many years that gender-affirming care for youth is medically necessary and that there is a scientific basis for providing such care, which in some cases is life-saving for young people. I will point out, not for the first time, that the medical profession used to believe that giving homosexuals electroshock was a good and valid thing. That the medical profession used to believe that cutting out pieces of a troublesome person's brain was a useful treatment in making them less troublesome. I could give many other examples, but the fact that medical professionals have formed a consensus does not prove anything with regard to ethics or efficacy. And let's move on to an essay by Lamprey Milt, who I know sometimes listens to this show. It's called Sleepwalking Land. It begins with a quote from Joe Strummer. Soap floods oil and water all churn in the wake on the great ship of progress. The crew can't find the brake. Klaxons are blaring. The admiral snores. Command submarines boil in oceans while the armies fight with suns. The essay proper begins, when social engineering came to town in the form of alphabet people affording affordable housing long before the pandemic, I was quick to pounce into action to rally the community. I went door to door informing people of a 55 and older alphabet people mixed-use rental building placed not 200 yards from a Catholic preschool. The thought of older men sodomizing each other in close proximity to children would be enough to spark some fire into the zombified white middle class. The day came for the town hall meeting, and I was all alone despite my rally cry. One middle-aged white man stood up and said, "Gays move in and my property value goes up. I welcome the proposed project." I lightly poo-pooed the idea by waxing and waning on safe talking points like parking and building height, yet I could never explain the nuances of weaponized anthropology to someone older, as it's the equivalent of explaining water to fish. I knew then and there that this country is done, and I'm going my own way. I don't really see how the introduction of so-called affordable housing anywhere for any people could be said to raise property values. But you see the boomer mentality here. The GDP, gotta drive up the GDP. Doesn't matter how you do it, it's gotta be done. It's the only metric regarding what you call human happiness that has any validity. Lamprey Milt continues, when the average person thinks of enemies, they often think of combat in general terms, the cartoon dictator with his colorful ribbons, or the sloppy jihadist with a mangy beard, but never various forms of subversion and the militant individualism that has given way to self-defeating, self-indulging, hedonistic attitudes, a prodigious ethos of feigning status that only money is a measure of equality. We have been under attack by dynamistic abstract notions of objective reality, insist that everything is culturally relative. The questioning of the question is the basis of the narrative. Have you ever noticed when you engage in a lighthearted debate with someone, you started off on one topic and began to engage in semantic acrobatics to prove a point? You went from talking about vaccines to identify politics in a matter of 45 seconds. That's because truth distracts people from their personal ambitions, so the truth is sacrificed for flexibility and tolerance. Relativism is a must to achieve openness, and this openness has led us adrift. The new normal is a perfectly acceptable arrangement to live as deracinated whites attempt to rationalize and justify the direction of the country. Unfortunately, most people seem to live their lives as if everything is just as it always is and always will be, locked in a tunnel vision with a lack of personal self-awareness, surrogate ambitions, and material wealth. I always punt the question, how do you think this is all going to end, when politics is brought up as a way of sidestepping an uncomfortable conversation, especially those stuck in the left-right paradigm. Lamprey Milt continues, then there is the concept of the United States being fluid, a moving goalpost, leaving it open-ended for interpretation. The non-aligned ethos lets our rulers at any juncture in time run roughshod. 20 years ago, it was about bombing a goat herder in rural Afghanistan. Today, it's the genital mutilation of white Christian males. 50 years ago, it was a detached house with 2.5 children. Today, it's a bug man's life in a studio apartment with a houseplant. The rules keep changing and you don't have any say on it. And if you were to question the morality of the ruling dogma, you are the bad guy. This is by definition a theocracy via inverted totalitarianism. When you remove religion from the state, a cabal of so-called experts dictates a society's zeitgeist. All of what has transpired the past year and a half reminds me of the MS Estonia tragedy, a ferry that sunk in the Baltic Sea during a heavy rainstorm in 1994. During initial investigations of the sinking, it was asked, how can 852 people die on a ship in the modern era with such state-of-the-art technologies and safety features? It can be summed up to those who died, froze in panic, and said, everything will be okay. They did not seem to believe or grasp the seriousness of the situation or could find no options for rational action. Those few who lived were young, fit, single males with a deep belief in God and Christ. Many escaped hastily and without taking the time to even put on clothes before jumping in the freezing Baltic. It's an interesting tale of human behavior, and reading about the survivors' recollections, speaking to their loved ones as the ship was sinking, trying to shake some sense into them. This is a very black pill essay. The facts the Lamprey Milt presents they're absolutely true. All of the trends he points out are true. But however, I always remember what Herbert Stein, that systems continue until they stop. That the system that we live in now in the West, it's insupportable. It truly is. When you have a nation like England in convulsions because mean things were said about 3 black soccer players who missed penalty kicks, or when you have a nation like the United States, which is in convulsions because a career criminal died in police custody, or a nation like Canada, which is in convulsions because graves of people who died 100 years or so ago are discovered, then we are clearly at the end of our tethers. Let's see. Oh, yes. This is from John Nolte of Breitbart. The White House is turning to coercion and spying because of the bungled vaccine rollout. Earlier this year, Biden stood before the public and announced a goal. By July 4th, he said at least 70% of all U.S. adults will have received at least one dose of the coronavirus vaccine. On Sunday, July the 4th, according to the CDC, the number was 67%, which is pretty darn close. Nevertheless, the White House, the media, and people like Dr. Anthony Fauci are freaking out. And yet, according to Jeff Zients, the White House COVID response coordinator, we've made a lot of progress. I think more progress, is fair to say, than anyone had expected, with 2 out of 3 Americans now with at least one shot of vaccine, and importantly, close to 90% of those 65 years and older with one shot, and close to 80% fully vaccinated. He added, that's particularly important because we started the vaccination campaign focused on the most vulnerable. So at least from my vantage point, things look pretty good. When your goal is 70%, you hit 67%. What's wrong with that? What more does Biden want? Well, the media and Democrats are still not happy because fascists are never happy until there's total compliance. And so the White House is moving to the coercion and spying phase of their vaccination rollout. This appears to be their 4-part plan, and it's not pretty. 1, get the FDA to approve the vaccine officially. 2, send government emissaries door to door to have a talk with the unvaccinated. 3, push for schools and businesses to mandate vaccinations. 4, fact check our text messages, which is spying. All this over a 3-point miss. From the beginning, Nolte writes, I've been upfront about my opinion on vaccines, which is that I hope everyone gets vaccinated. But looking at those vaccination numbers, the 67%, etc., I honestly don't see a problem. Here are the survivability rates per the Centers for Disease Control per age group. 0 to 19, 99.997%. 20 to 49, 99.98%. 50 to 69, 99.5%. And 70 plus, 94.6. The CDC does not have numbers for those over the age of 80, but we can assume they're worse than the 70 plus group. Well, in my country of Canada, the average age of those who are deemed to have died from COVID has risen to 84 which is longer than typical longevity in my country, which tells you something, or should at any rate. Let's go to lockdown skeptics. 2/3 of UK adults fully vaccinated against COVID. Is this the level of opposition to restrictions? Opinion polls are sometimes poor at distinguishing between virtue signaling and what people really think. Respondents tell the pollsters what they think they're supposed to say, especially on issues that have become moralized, like anti-COVID measures. But actions speak louder than words. So the news that 19% of people have deleted the National Health Service COVID app, which pings to tell you to self-isolate if you are identified as someone who's come into contact with a person who's tested positive, and so joined the 32% of people who never had it, according to a new ComRes poll, perhaps gives a better indication of how many people are not so keen on COVID restrictions. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, over a third, 34% have deleted the app, which is as many as still have it, while 21% never downloaded it in the first place, despite 98% owning a smartphone. To my mind, statistics like these are a much more realistic indicator of who actually supports restrictions, since if you're not willing to self-isolate when potentially infected, how can you be in favor of less targeted measures? This would mean just 42% of people are genuinely in favor of restrictions continuing. True, you have to allow for the 16% of adults who don't have a smartphone. If we assume this group splits in their views in the same proportions as those who do have a smartphone, then we get 44.5% against restrictions in practice versus 50.5% in favor. And nightclubs to ignore government plea to check customers' vaccine status. Yes, we've been crippled. Our business has been crippled over the last year and a half. And your guidance is that maybe we should just kill it once and for all. You know what? Say nightclub owners, we're not going to do that. Masks will stay on London transport for as long as the virus is still with us, says Mayor Sadiq Khan, which effectively means forever. London commuters hoping to return to normality after July 19th are in for disappointment. As Sadiq Khan says, face masks will remain compulsory on transport networks within the city beyond Freedom Day and for as long as the virus is still with us. London is the first city to announce that it will continue mandating mask wearing after this date. Greater Manchester looks set to be the next, with Mayor Andy Burnham refusing to rule out keeping restrictions. And is the rioting in South Africa caused by lockdown? I don't know whether this is true, but people were reporting yesterday or earlier today that there are indications that the security forces in South Africa are running out of ammunition. South Africa has now witnessed multiple days of deadly riots. More than 70 people have been killed and whole city districts have been ransacked. Shocking videos posted on Twitter show looters pouring out of shops with stolen merchandise, vigilantes armed with rifles firing into crowds, and fleeing police vans being pelted with rocks. The riots were triggered by last week's 15-month jail sentence of Jacob Zuma, the country's former president, on corruption charges. But many have suggested that poverty and unemployment help fuel the lawlessness. Without wishing to excuse the wanton criminality on display, it's worth considering whether lockdown is a factor here. South Africa's unemployment rate stands at 32.6%, the highest since the labor force survey began in 2008. Youth unemployment is almost 75%. Last year, the country's GDP fell by 7%, the largest single drop since 1980, when the IMF's data series begins. While unemployment has been rising for more than a decade in South Africa, the country's dismal economic situation was exacerbated by months of lockdown. How stringent has the lockdown been? We can check using the Oxford Blavatnik School's COVID-19 government response tracker. Since the start of the pandemic, South Africa has had 228 days of mandatory workplace closures and 421 days of mandatory stay-at-home orders in at least part of the country. Lockdowns were damaging enough in countries in Britain that could afford to pay for lavish furlough schemes, but they must have been even more destructive in South Africa, where almost 1 in 5 people lives in extreme poverty. How these individuals were supposed to cope when the economy was put on standby is anyone's guess. Noah Carl continues or concludes, I'm not trying to absolve the looters of responsibility. There's no excuse for what they've been doing, but we should ask, how responsible was it for the government to impose months of sweeping restrictions in a country where many people are quite literally living hand to mouth? And likewise, how responsible was it for Western governments to impose sweeping restrictions over their own economies, knowing what effect this would have in the developing world? Well, I guess we can worry about all those things later, right? Because we can just keep on spending trillions of dollars that we don't have. And what's the worst that could happen? Well, what's the inflation rate in the United States up to? 7.5%? Now, the government's been saying for years that, oh, it's 1%, 1.5%, which is a bald-faced lie, because the basket that is used to figure out the consumer price index doesn't include a lot of things that people actually use, like real estate, cost thereof. Oh, and cost of healthcare and cost of education. So it's bogus. Let's go to Alex Berenson, who attaches a story from Sky News. COVID-19, UK daily coronavirus cases exceed 40,000, highest since mid-January. The number of daily coronavirus infections is the highest for 6 months, as 49 more people have died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. The UK has reported 42,302 new coronavirus cases and 49 more deaths in the latest 24-hour period. It is the highest number of daily infections since January 15th. And Berenson comments, the speed at which the vaccines are failing is astonishing. The UK, the most vaccinated major country in the world, reported 42,000 cases today, almost 100 times, yes, 100 times as many as the same day in 2020. And hospitalizations and deaths are unfortunately beginning to soar. Florida orders schools to reopen in the fall for in-person instruction. Berenson comments, Florida man ignores media, does right thing over and over and over. I'm reviewing the school closing fiasco for pandemia, and Governor Ron DeSantis deserves endless props for this and so much else. Almost no one else stood up to the teachers' unions. And moving on, let's talk about Afghanistan. Did you know there was a war there? You know there was a war that was going on since 2001, that the United States was involved in for 20 years, that Britain was involved in for, a decade, that Canada was involved in for, 11 or 12 years, and that we lost? Not a lot of attention being paid to this. Henry Delacroix writes in the American Sun, where you can also find Lamprey Milk. That's at theamericansun.com. American involvement in another war theater ends. No victory, it just ends. America does not win wars, nor do we outright lose them. With definitive peace treaties with pomp and circumstance, we do lose long term, and in the slow bleed of the process, America is pulling out of Afghanistan, but there will be no dramatic video of an escape like in Saigon. The most critical piece for this moment is that there is no election coming up, nor a Republican in the Oval Office. The media does not have a target to wield the images of a collapsing Kabul for its gain. The entire establishment has been the only force in America pushing for us to remain there. It is a united establishment, as the Afghanistan Papers did not result in a full-hearted pullout. When Trump wanted out, even after their release, he was stymied by the permanent bureaucracy and their friends in the media. Any video of Afghan National Army forces surrendering en masse, handing over weapons and giving up at the first opportunity will not lead the national news. Viral videos will stay viral and not be given broad establishment amplification. Humvees are falling into the Taliban's arms with no hysterical emotion from pundits compared to their theatrics about anything the last 5 years. This is the normal state of Afghanistan coverage. It was a low-level war after the initial invasion that was portrayed as good and worthy of our full attention, unlike Iraq, Obama's Afghan surge was good, even if no one knew why. After Osama bin Laden's death in Pakistan, we were told it was still worthwhile, even though the only rationale was sending Afghani girls to school. Coverage was muted as we only learned of U.S. military indifference to bachabazi when a U.S. soldier blew the whistle. Bachabazi is a tradition in Afghanistan of the violent rape of boys as young as 10 years old by old men. Americans were told over 90% of global poppies were grown in Afghanistan, and despite military assets in country and an opioid epidemic in America, no one burned the poppy fields. It was a decade of little news except to prevent a full withdrawal. The Taliban controls 85% of Afghanistan now. A large difference between 2001 and today is that there is no Northern Alliance-held stronghold. The day before 9/11, the Northern Alliance's charismatic made-for-Hollywood leader was assassinated. No multilingual, telegenic leader did not slow down the U.S. with destroying the regime, but no one has stepped into the vacuum. Now the pullout could be for a repurposing of the Taliban and ISIS-controlled Islamist assets. We aided them in the 80s, fought them in the 21st century, but now we can ask them to pivot to China with America. The weapons the Taliban are collecting are laundered through the Afghan army, similar to the Syrian weapons laundering to ISIS in last decade's proxy fight. This is on China's border and offers a refuge and training ground for Uyghurs a la Syria. Terror camps can reopen, but this time be aimed at China. This might explain the NatSec community finally allowing a pullout after the fit they pitched at prior attempts by Obama or Trump. I've argued for years that it's pointless. It was pointless for these Western countries to be in Afghanistan because whatever they were doing was not going to win any war. And given the nature of Afghanistan, there was only one thing that the Western countries could have done to win any war, which is genocide. Not cultural genocide, not people's feelings hurt by imagined white supremacy, but real genocide. And since obviously the Western countries didn't want to pursue a campaign of genocide, there's no way they could win. They spent trillions of dollars not learning this lesson. Gunnar Heinsohn writes in The American Thinker, between 1979 and 1989, 14,500 Soviet invaders died in Afghanistan. At least 700,000 Afghan warriors and civilians lost their lives in this conflict. Yet over the course of the war, the number of young combat-ready Afghans, ages 15 to 29, declined by 110,000 from 1.76 million to 1.65 million. America should have been warned by the Soviet disaster in Afghanistan. To their sorrow, the Russians had been exposed to what military analysts call an asymmetric advantage, an edge on the battlefield that opponents cannot match. In the case of Afghanistan, the advantage is demographic. Up to the year 2000, an average Afghan woman gave birth to 7 or 8 children in her lifetime. Up to 2020, the average was still 5 or 6. Therefore, Afghan mothers are able to replace 2 to 3 times the number of sons who perish on the battlefield. Because they had failed to learn from the Soviet lesson, the Americans and the British who bombed al-Qaeda's Afghanistan base in October 2001 were unaware that their target already had 2.7 million young men of military age, 1 million more than when Moscow had been defeated 2 decades earlier. To their peril, they did not take demographics into account. Students of the author, NATO officers at the Defense College in Rome, repeatedly confirmed with dismay that their nations were as clueless about military demographics as the Kremlin had been before. They knew about their Afghan adversaries' guns and bazookas, but not about his almost limitless ability to absorb casualties. Now, sadder and perhaps a little wiser, America and the West are following in Russia's footsteps and leaving Afghanistan without victory. Those who oppose this withdrawal predict that the Taliban will continue its struggle for power more ferociously than before. And they are right, but for a reason they themselves usually don't mention if they know it at all. In July 2021, Afghanistan has nearly 6 million males of prime fighting age 15 to 29. This record number is expected to rise to 7.4 million by 2030. Even in 2025, Afghanistan's war index, i.e. its demographic capacity for waging war, will be 5.2, 5 times higher than America's 1.0 and 7 times Germany's 0.7. I should mention, of course, that after the debacle in Vietnam, the American military and establishment came up with a new doctrine about fighting wars, which is that our soldiers don't get killed anymore. At the height of the number of KIAs in American KIAs in Iraq, there was a near panic. You could feel it among the elite. But the numbers out of Iraq, however tragic they may have been, came nowhere close to the numbers coming out of Vietnam during the height of that struggle. To paraphrase Hilaire Belloc, we have absolute air superiority and they do not. So therefore, we can simply bomb them into submission. Well, that hasn't worked. In a related story by Stephen Nelson in the New York Post, the Biden administration Wednesday announced plans to evacuate Afghanistan citizens who assisted U.S. troops in fighting the Taliban, dubbing the mission Operation Allies Refuge. Flights out of the war-torn country will begin at the end of July, ahead of the final withdrawal of U.S. troops by August the 31st. A senior administration official said the United States is launching Operation Allies Refuge to support relocation flights for interested and eligible Afghan nationals and their families who have supported the United States and our partners in Afghanistan. Yes, so the United States fights in Vietnam and ends up with millions of Vietnamese. The United States fights in Somali, however briefly, and ends up with a whole bunch of Somalis. So now the United States is going to end up with a whole bunch of Afghanistan people because they will start sponsoring their relatives from the old country. Canada has ended up with a whole bunch of Somalis, which has led to considerable problems in my country, problems which can be ameliorated only by bringing in more Somalis, apparently. I responded to this. I'm sick of being demanded to import foreigners to my country who betrayed their own country for money. David Camp had tweeted, the push to give visas to Afghans is from military bureaucrats who went native over there. The Afghan support staff didn't just interpret, they provided most administrative support. They're probably the most educated in the country. Doesn't hurt that the women can be quite striking. But the military leadership are bureaucrats in uniforms and willing partners for globalist plans. If they'll carry out globalist ventures like occupying Afghanistan, they'll gladly help out importing them into our countries. Yes, this sounds like a wonderfully smart plan, doesn't it? Bomb the hell out of a foreign country for 2 decades, then invite the survivors to live with us and pray that they don't hold a grudge. Oh, and what does W have to say about this? Well, I mean, this story writes itself, doesn't it? This is from Yaron Steinbuch at the New York Post. Former President George W. Bush Wednesday criticized the withdrawal of American and NATO forces from Afghanistan, saying that he fears that women and girls in the country will suffer unspeakable harm at the hands of the Taliban. Asked in an interview with German news outlet Deutsche Welle whether the withdrawal is a mistake, the former Republican president replied, quote, I think it is, yeah, because I think the consequences are going to be unbelievably bad, unquote. My own country said Stephen Harper and other Canadian government leaders made it quite clear. Why is Canada in Afghanistan? What possible relevance could that godforsaken place have for us? It's a war for feminism. Yes, it's a war for feminism. Let's get people killed and waste trillions of dollars in a doomed attempt to impose third wave feminism on Afghani women. And in a somewhat related story, it's from Thomas Lifson again at the American Thinker. The signs are clear that the United States Navy is in crisis. A series of ship disasters, including the scrapping of the $750 million carrier, the Bonhomme Richard, after a fire, and the fatal seaborne collision of the guided missile destroyer Fitzgerald that killed 7 sailors, have revealed problems with training and readiness. China, which now has more ships in its navy than we do, is boasting of having chased a U.S. warship out of disputed waters. The Chinese are not necessarily reliable, but the mere fact that they make this boast, combined with this aggressive buildup in the sea lanes controlling a huge share of the world's trade, that is worrisome enough. But a new report from 2 retired senior flag officers, one from the Navy and one from the Marines, is a definite cause for worry and ought to spark congressional hearings and serious reforms. If I recall correctly, one of the crash of the Fitzgerald occurred because there were 2 female officers among the officers on the deck. One of them was in charge of communications, and they weren't speaking to each other because she knows what she did, and that's why obviously you need more women in the military. The Daily Mail summarizes in its trademark bullet point fashion: members of Congress commissioned the report on issues in the surface Navy, came in response to fire on ship in San Diego and 2 ship collisions in Pacific. Retired Marine General and Navy admirals spoke with current and former officers. They identified a number of disturbing trends in Navy leadership and training. Many officers said that diversity training took precedence over warfighting. They claimed combat readiness had become a box-checking exercise. But so long as there's more women and more minorities and more transsexuals, then that makes up for it. Does it not? I mean, it would have to be. Otherwise, this would just be disastrous situation. I'm going to move on to the delayed Music Monday. And I'm going to be talking about the Second Vienna or Second Viennese School, which is closely associated with the composer Arnold Schoenberg and his 2 most famous pupils, Alban Berg and Anton von Webern. This is a movement which coalesced shortly before the beginning of the First World War. It struck me, if politics follows from culture, if you look at what happened in culture in the years shortly before the First World War broke out in 1914, you find various intimations of disaster. For instance, the rise of atonalism in music and Schoenberg's 12-tone system. In art, you have movements, plastic arts, you have movements like futurism and vorticism. And in literature, you have movements like the decadent movement. And they all seem to portend that something terrible was going to happen in Europe as it transpired. There are many people at the time, particularly in England, who were speaking, and you can see this in how Robert Falcon Scott became such a great hero in England, because he was a riposte to the supposed decadence of the English, that they were, effete, they'd become effete. And Robert Falcon Scott proved with his blundering, which caused the death of himself and his crew, that no, the Englishman was still strong and heroic. Schoenberg is one of the most fascinating figures in music to me. There are few examples of a man as, how would you say, rebellious as he was, although he was rebellious in a formal sense. He was by nature, personally and politically conservative. He was born in 1874 and he died in 1951. He died in Los Angeles. He joined Stravinsky there. He was a Jew, but he was a patriotic Austrian who was proud of his service in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War. You know, you can talk about Richard Wagner as a rebel perhaps as greater than Schoenberg was. The point is that Wagner prevailed. Wagner made various wild claims that his music was going to revolutionize opera, that his music was going to revolutionize tonality, that a theater planned, designed by him, was going to be built at Bayreuth for the sole purpose of putting on his operas. And all of these seemed like the claims of a madman, but they all came true. And within Wagner's own lifetime, the so-called War of the Romantics broke out. That such was the appeal of Wagner's music and his musical theories among the younger generation, that composers, such as Brahms, were execrated as being not just old-fashioned, but simply barely music more. Schoenberg was almost entirely self-taught as a composer. He learned from textbooks and later wrote his own textbook on music. He was obviously a very highly intelligent man. I remember years ago, this would have been in the 1970s, I was reading a biography of Schoenberg, and I learned that he bound his own books. And I'd been interested in this idea because I had a large number of hardcover books, but I also had softcover books, and I've always been of the opinion that softcover books are not really books. They're reading copies. So I thought, perhaps I can bind my own books. And then I learned later on that Schoenberg designed and built his own furniture. So I thought, it seems that binding books is something that I would not be very good at. Schoenberg began as a romantic, and a piece of his that was published in 1899 called Verklärte Nacht, or Transfigured Night, is, to my mind, the most romantic piece of music ever written. It exists in a version for sextet, and also in a full version for orchestra. And of course, it's based on a poem by Richard Demel, which is about a man who is cuckolded by his woman, who is pregnant by the other man, and they are transfixed by the moon, by the night, and he agrees. He decides that he is going to stay with her and accept the bastard child as his own. At the time, Schoenberg was one of those who were pushing musical tonality as far as it can go. There was a concert held in 1913, notice that 1 year before World War II. It was eventually called the Scandal Concert. And this is the program: 6 pieces for orchestra by Anton von Webern, 4 orchestral songs on poems by Maurice Maeterlinck, by Alexander von Zemlinsky. Zemlinsky ended up being related to Schoenberg by marriage, but Zemlinsky kept up the Romanticism. He did not become a modernist in the way that the Second Vienna School did. Also on the program was Schoenberg's first chamber symphony, and 2 of the 5 orchestral songs on picture postcard text by Peter Altenberg, by Alban Berg. There was supposed to be a performance of Mahler's. Mahler had died 2 years earlier, of his Kinder Totenlieder, songs on the death of children, but it did not occur because a riot broke out at the concert punches were thrown, lawsuits were filed. And of course, there's often a repeated story that Oscar Strauss of that family, who was there, said that the slap had been the prettiest sound of the evening. If you listen to these works, such as Webern's Six Pieces for Orchestra, Schoenberg's Chamber Symphony No. 1, and Berg's orchestral songs on the picture postcard texts, they don't sound all that strange today. They were, pretty much of a piece, as I say, as this great expansion of tonality, or you could look at it, the collapse of tonality. That again, there's this very rich strain of romanticism in Schoenberg's early works. Schoenberg came to the conclusion that tonality was exhausted. Now, he would later say there's plenty of great music still to be written in the key of C major. He decided that he was going to come up with his own new system, something radically different, and that this system was going to be adopted, and that he said that it would preserve the triumph or the centrality of German music for the next 100 years. That did not happen, and I'm referring to his 12-tone system, or the dodecaphonic system, where you have these tone rows. Now, Richard Taruskin, the famed critic, quite a wise man, he has written about this mania for process in Schoenberg. And, we're getting some musical accompaniment. This process that, no, the problem with music is that tonality is exhausted, so this is a problem in process. I have come up with a new process, and so problem solved. Well, again, it didn't work out that way. That Taruskin has also written about the problem of so-called progression in music, and I suppose you could look at this as a kind of equivalent to the Whig interpretation of history, that which follows from where we are, it must be better than what we had previously. And since that is the case, we now stand at the apogee of human achievement. Taruskin first expressed this in his essay, The Poetic Fallacy. And yes, there's no evidence. There's no evidence that history is a process of progression. There's no evidence that music is there's any evidence of progression there. None whatsoever. None. But this is very strongly believed, even today, despite the fact that the so-called new music has never been a success. It has never, ever been a success. Now, if you look at Schoenberg's pupil, Alban Berg, and when I say pupil, this was all informal. Alban Berg's work employs 12-tone techniques, but it is not as, how shall I say, as stringent, as dry as Schoenberg's. And we see that Wozzeck, Berg's first opera, was a success during his lifetime, and it remains in the repertory. That his second opera, Lulu, which was abandoned at his death in 1937, pieces from it had been performed. It turns out that his wife, who lived for decades after Berg's death, he died from septicemia, from a bee sting, strangely enough. Apparently his wife became obsessed with the idea that Lulu was full of coded references and numerological references to a mistress of Berg, and so she forbade the completion of it. And it was completed in 1979. It has been recorded many times, and it has become part of the repertory. I'm trying to think of a piece by Schoenberg that is a part of the repertory, and perhaps only his early piece, Verklärte Nacht, which I mentioned earlier. But other popular pieces by Berg include his violin concerto and his three pieces for orchestra and his chamber concerto. Herbert von Karajan, of all people, late in his life, took up the championship of the Second Vienna School. And I suppose one of the great complaints against the school is that the music is not beautiful, that it is not capable of being made beautiful. Well, of course, one of the great criticisms of Karajan is that he strove for beauty over understanding, and he managed, at least to my satisfaction, to make the pieces that he recorded beautiful. Now, the three pieces for orchestra, Berg's Opus 6, Karajan had something interesting to say about it, which is one of the three works that says, one of the three great works that says no. And the others were Brahms's Fourth Symphony, which ends in a minor key, and Sibelius's Fourth Symphony, and the third being Berg's six pieces. Anton von Webern, oddly, as I suppose, enjoyed the least success in terms of his music being popular. But strangely enough, he became a great guru, a figure. And partly it's because of the accident of his death, that he was born in 1883, and he died on September the 15th, 1945. He'd been given, this was in Vienna, and of course Vienna was devastated, and he was very pleased to have been given the gift of a cigar, which he was smoking in a darkened hallway, and a drunken American soldier thought that he was some sort of threat and shot him to death. And so Webern became a martyr figure. And one can argue that classical music after the Second World War was absolutely blighted by Webern's influence. That everyone has to become a serialist now. And amazingly, even Stravinsky was bullied into this. And many other composers that one would never have associated, they were bullied into it. Of course, Pierre Boulez, who I consider one of the great musical frauds of the 20th century, well, he died in 2016, became a particular champion of Webern. Boulez was a modernist composer who, how many pieces did this fellow write? He didn't get very far with this, but he was achieved sort of godlike status. And then he turned, I guess his composing was pretty much exhausted, not that there was much there to begin with. You see a similar thing with Leonard Bernstein. That Bernstein was first known as a conductor, but of course, there's West Side Story and other works. And he ran dry. So he redoubled his efforts in terms of conducting, and got signed to Deutsche Grammophon and became, one of the great conductors, although I certainly don't think so. And of course, Boulez achieved perhaps an even greater reputation as a conductor than Lenny did. But Boulez recorded no fewer than 2 complete versions of Webern's works. The first one was on CBS, and it consisted of 3 CDs. Yes, that is how little music Webern wrote in his life. Now, you can say he died early, not for a composer, though. He was 61 years old when he died. You could look at what Mozart was 35 years old when he died. Yes, and later Boulez did a more expansive collected edition of Webern for a Deutsche Grammophon, which runs into, I don't know, 6 or 7. Every conceivable trifle, every little adaptation or whatever is included in this. But again, you see with Webern perhaps a crystallization of a destructive tendency that had begun in classical music with Beethoven. Haydn wrote 104 numbered symphonies, and there are others. I mean, depending on how you count them, Haydn wrote 108 or 109 symphonies, and there's not a bad one among them, and many of them are some of the greatest ever written. But with Beethoven, we see this romantic attitude that music, each piece of music must be substantially, critically different from the one that came before it. And so you end up getting fewer and fewer and fewer works. And you end up with someone like Leonard Bernstein reworking things over and over and over again instead of moving on. Despite his 12-tone system, there is still much to admire in the work of Schoenberg and Alban Berg. Webern, not so much. But again, I want to talk about the influence that until the rise of the so-called minimalists, the reign of terror of serialism was complete in classical music. And one of the reasons for that is that classical music had been captured by the Academy. No longer was it necessary for composers to make a living by selling copies of their works or by performing them and getting public to see them. No, the taxpayers paid for these people to be ensconced in universities where they could write music that nobody wanted to hear. And it doesn't matter. It didn't matter to them because their needs were taken care of. So those are my thoughts on the Second Vienna School. Again, you could do worse than to take a chance on Karajan's recordings of them because, again, he strove for beauty above all, and there is much beauty in his recordings on Deutsche Grammophon. Let's have a final look at the chat. Oh, yes, one thing I wanted to say that I should have said earlier, that there has been actually science applied to the question of why do we like certain types of music and why do we not like other types? And it appears that this is hardwired in us. And the type of music that 12-tone music was never going to appeal to very many people for that reason. I may have told this anecdote before, but I had a friend when I worked at Alberta Report who spent an enormous amount of money and time buying so-called free jazz records. And I once told him, after I'd had a couple, that I didn't believe that he ever listened to these records. I mean, I really listened to them. And he was rather astonished. And he said, why not? And I said, because if you did, you'd throw yourself out of a window. And let's see, Neil Terry says, atonal music always struck me as just try-hard academic BS. Not to say you can't play with tonality. Of course you can, but the system isn't much. Neil Terry says, I read an old book called Horns, Strings, and Harmony. Says pretty much the tonalism is baked into human music. Yes, indeed. Indeed, it appears to be. Visionary Companion says, Bernstein, Karajan. I will choose Karajan every time because of what I know about Bernstein. I don't really care that much about that stuff, although I read a woman, her name was Pizer. Quite a good book about Bernstein. He was an appalling human being. Of course, Karajan had his faults as well. But the thing about Bernstein is his manner on the podium. he's hopping up and down, and it's just embarrassing. Unwatchable. Also, the recordings that he made, or at least the ones he made for CBS, this American style of recording, that this close miking, it doesn't sound very good. And Bernstein, he just loved excess. For instance, taking the first Brahms piano concerto and him and Glenn Gould, inflating it to 60 minutes, and then taking Elgar's Enigma variations and slowing them, bringing the tempo down to such an extent that the music becomes entirely becalmed. He recorded this with the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and something close to a rebellion broke out, with the BBC musicians saying something like, "This is our music. We have been playing it for generations, and we don't like you, a Yank, coming here and telling us we're doing it all wrong." Visionary Companion says, "I once purchased an album of later John Coltrane. I listened to it once, and that was it." Media Hit says, "John Zorn received grants from the state of New York." Peter Blakevat is a musician that I'm particularly fond of. Worked with John Zorn, and I was Peter Blakevat completist. He's worked with a lot of very different people, and so I bought the John Zorn record and I listened to it once, and this is intolerable. This is absolutely intolerable. His infernal tootling. Anran says, "Whatever is false, there are still many good Bernstein recordings, and West Side Story is wonderful." No, West Side Story is good, but he just kept reworking it and reworking it. And let's bring opera singers in to record it. And let's do another version, a televisual version with opera singers. He could have been writing more original music, but as I say, I just think he came to the conclusion that he was tapped out. I love Bernstein's score for On the Waterfront, says Halper, as I do. Bernstein was he was quite clear about this. People would call him Bernstein, and he would say, Stein, the name is Bernstein. So some controversy broke out that I talked about. What was it, last year? That someone argued that calling people something Stein is anti-Semitic and deliberately anti-Semitic and, deliberately insulting. And I thought, what about those people who are named just Stein? Is that insulting too? Okay. The Taxi Driver soundtrack is good. Bernard Herrmann says, Media Hits. Indeed it is. Coltrane at 65 was unlistenable, says Visionary Companion. Neil Terry says, even many non-Western musics aren't atonal because they have different scales. They're more monotonal, if anything, meditative rather than exploratory. Okay. Is that it? I'm not a Bernstein fan, says Neil Terry, but I do like Bernstein's Scheherazade. Lots of versions seem pretty dry, but I've since found others that match the level of expression. This week's Save on Foods flyer is above average, says Brendan Smith. Okay, I will check it out. Was Wagner just winging it 90% of the time? I don't think so. He spent an awful long time on his scores, writing the words and then the music. He was a very hard worker. What is this? Modus Eckstein's Rites of Spring, the Great War, and the Birth of the Modern Age might be a good book to discuss here, says Visionary Companion. Thank you. Thank you for that. Jim Smith says George W. Bush had no sympathies for the young boys in Kandahar who were suddenly in the position of concubines to middle-aged and older Afghani men after the Taliban was defeated. Well, yes, standing up against the Taliban means, standing up against lots of things, including, the destruction of ancient Buddhist statues and the like, and, women not getting an education. But the Taliban very strongly against, the T-boys, very strong against the opium trade. Which Jaakko Raipala, our Finnish friend, says, I have relatives who watched the new one and they were not massively engaged about it, so I assume it's at least not hyper paused. That's all I know about it. I don't know what that's a reference to. The recent one, again, I'm getting closer, directed by, okay, I don't know. Perhaps that will have to remain a mystery. Perhaps someone can remind me of it. Tomorrow, Jonathan Ferguson says, hi, Jim. I met a lovely countryman of yours at the Dominion Day rally at the Supreme Court. I was glad to discover that not all Australians are brainwashed. And with that, one more from Yo Mama. Liberalism has a demonic vitality to it that allows it to survive its own contradictions. I don't know. When you consider that the hatred that the blacks have for the Jews and, the rise of the Hotep movement, say, protesting against the gay subsuming of Black American culture, I just don't see. I don't see this coalition holding together for much longer. That's it for today. I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow is Thursday, and so it's Theater Thursday, and I am going to be talking about, satire, very funny movie by George Axelrod from 1966 called Lord Love a Duck. And on the book club on Friday, a rather grim work about globalization, democracy, American imperialism, and market-dominant minorities called World on Fire by Amy Chua. And on Music Monday, next Monday, July the 19th, it's a Sparks show tonight. It's a band that I have loved for almost 50 years, and strangely enough, they're well into their 70s now, the Mail Brothers, and this is the year of Sparks. They have reached their apotheosis with Edgar Wright's documentary, The Sparks Brothers, and by a film that they wrote for the French director Léos Carax called Annette, which had a tempestuous audience response on the first day of this year's Cannes Festival. So thank you so much for tuning in. I will be back, as I said, tomorrow at the normal time. If you like the show or any part of it, I would appreciate it if you would click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which would be exceedingly well appreciated at this uncertain time in my life, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations to this live stream can be made directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a real human connection to ease the burden. Good night.